Today we uncover the shocking truth about modern UK meat pies. Who remembers when a pie for two, a proper family-sized pie you'd cut into wedges at the table, actually looked like it was meant for two people? Buy one today and what lands in your basket is closer to something you'd get from a hatch at halftime. Actually, wait till you see the pies at the footy, because compared to some of tonight's list, even those look generous. Pies used to be a Friday night treat your dad brought home from the chip shop, wrapped in paper that went see-through with the grease, or a Sunday one your mum had waiting when you got in from playing out. Thick gravy, a crust that snapped rather than gave, and enough meat in there that you knew exactly what you were eating without needing to check a label. But now, you'd be lucky to find a chunk of meat you could identify as actual meat, rather than an anonymous grey paste doing its best impression of one. Because these pies aren't made by a baker with his sleeves rolled up, or even a company who puts pride into their work. Instead, they're made by corporate boardrooms and shareholders chasing a margin, with every ingredient measured out by machines built to use the least amount of meat they can legally get away with. And the rest of the pie? Filled in with modified starch, water, and a nostalgic whisper of what used to actually be in there. Machine pies, not pies made by anyone with any pride in the finished product. Soulless, heartless, entirely manufactured food, wrapped in packaging that still looks like your granddad's local bakery made it. Here's the part nobody tells you while you're queuing at the till. Several of Britain's best-known pies now list water as a bigger ingredient than the meat they're named after. One famous pasty brand puts almost as much potato in the box as beef. Another, still trading heavily on a royal endorsement from the 1700s, comes in at barely a quarter meat once you actually read the label. And the pie with the most meat on tonight's entire list still needs a flavour enhancer to taste convincingly of anything at all. We went through the current ingredient lists on the meat pies sitting in Britain's supermarket fridges and freezers right now, the ones warming under glass on the chip shop counter, and the ones still famous for coming in a tin you have to fight open. We looked at what long-time buyers are actually saying about them, and we're about to tell you the 9 British meat pies that are living entirely off a reputation that stopped being accurate years ago. And then we'll give you the handful which you seriously have to try, and still rightfully deserve a place in your basket. Before we get into it, if you want to see British food brands actually held to account instead of coasting on nostalgia, hit that like button, and more importantly, click the hype button. That's the one that actually tells YouTube this story matters, and it helps put it in front of more people who are still buying these pies out of pure habit, the way their parents did. Every hype click is a small vote for higher standards, and for companies actually explaining what they've changed instead of just hoping nobody looks too closely at the label. And let's get into it. Number 9. Fray Bentos steak and kidney pie. There's a particular ritual attached to this, one that a lot of you will already know. And it usually involves somebody putting the whole sealed tin straight into the oven and forgetting to take the lid off first. Fray Bentos has been part of British cupboards since the years just after the war, when a hot pie you could keep in a cupboard for months felt like a genuine bit of modern magic. Baxter's, who've owned the brand since 2011 and manufacture it in Fokkerburgh in Scotland, still market it as an iconic British name. And in fairness, very few brands have earned that word as honestly. What they don't put on the front of the tin is that water is now the very first ingredient on the current label, ahead of everything else in the pie. Beef sits at around 10 to 15% depending on the exact line, pork kidney at around 8 to 11%, with palm oil, modified maize starch, and a long list of flavourings and extracts doing most of the remaining work. Long-time buyers online are surprisingly consistent about this. They tend to describe the pastry as fine, sometimes even genuinely good, but the filling is noticeably thinner than they remember. Tiny scattered pieces of meat floating through a heavy uniform gravy rather than proper chunks you actually have to chew. Countless people remember these pies being good as a kid, and they're sad to see how far they've fallen. It's also worth knowing that this isn't the first time the Fray Bentos name has taken a serious hit to public trust. Back in 1964, a serious typhoid outbreak in Aberdeen, which tragically killed 3 people, was officially traced by public health investigators to a tin of Fray Bentos corned beef contaminated during processing in South America. The brand survived that, rebuilt its reputation over decades, and became a genuine national favourite all over again. It's a shame that 6 decades later, it's the quiet stuff doing the damage instead. The water, the palm oil, the shrinking meat content that nobody announced and nobody explained. It's fair to say the online debate about this one isn't entirely one-sided. Plenty of people admit they might be looking back through nostalgia goggles rather than remembering the actual pie accurately, and some are genuinely unsure whether the recipe changed or their own tastes simply did. What almost nobody disputes, though, is the specific point about meat content. Whichever side of that argument you land on, the current label settles it. There's less meat in the tin than there used to be, and considerably more water and starch doing the job it used to do. Fray Bentos isn't the only tin or box in this category, leaning on a story from decades ago, while the ingredients quietly move on without telling anyone. Number 8. Holland's Potato and Meat Pie. Holland's has been baking in Lancashire since 1851, and for a lot of people north of Birmingham, this isn't really a brand, it's just what a pie is supposed to be. The company is now owned by Two Sisters Food Group, one of the largest chicken and ready meal processors in the country, and the current ingredient label tells you almost everything you need to know about what changed once the ownership did. Water is the first ingredient listed. Potato comes in at around 21 to 22%. Sit with those two numbers for a second, because there is more than double the amount of potato in a Holland's potato and meat pie than there is meat in a product still sold, quite plainly, as a meat pie. There's also a flour treatment agent on the current label called L-cysteine hydrochloride, a genuinely common additive across industrial baking, and one that can be derived from sources including human hair or duck feathers, according to widely documented food industry sourcing, before being heavily processed into something with no visible resemblance to either. It isn't dangerous, and it's entirely legal, it's just not the sort of ingredient that sits comfortably alongside a proper Lancashire baker, printed across the front of the box. This is another one of those machine pies, wearing heritage language that's considerably older than the recipe actually inside it. Holland's pies have sat on matchday menus at football grounds right across the northwest for decades, and there's a real lived affection for the brand that goes well beyond the supermarket shelf. That's exactly why this one stings more than most. Long-time buyers who remember the version sold 30 years ago, back when it was still part of Northern Foods, rather than Two Sisters, tend to describe a noticeably heavier, meatier pie than the one currently in the fridge, and the switch in ownership is the point where most of those memories seem to divide into before and after. Number 7. Ginsters Cornish Pasty. This is a genuinely trickier one than most of the others on this list, because unlike some of the brands we're covering tonight, Ginsters isn't hiding behind a vague or borrowed name. The pasty currently on shelves does carry proper protected geographical indication status, and the label genuinely does say 100% British beef, and both of those claims stand up. Founded in Callington, Cornwall, back in 1967 by a Cornish dairy farmer and owned by Samworth Brothers since 1988, Ginsters has grown from a small local bakery into one of the biggest savoury pastry operations in the entire country. So here's the contradiction worth sitting with. Everything printed on that label is technically true, and the beef content still only comes in at around 14 to 15%, behind potato, wheat flour, and a blend of palm, rapeseed, and sunflower oil. It's the nation's favourite by their own sales figures, and it's still mostly potato and pastry wrapped around a peppery gravy, with a fairly modest amount of actual meat running through it. That's not a scandal, and nobody's lying to you here. It's just worth knowing, next time you grab one at a service station purely out of habit, that the county pride on the wrapper is doing a lot more work than the beef inside it. What used to be a small operation turning out a couple of dozen pasties a day back in the late 1960s is now a genuinely industrial bakery producing pasties, slices and pies by the million. Sold in petrol stations and motorway services from one end of the country to the other. That's not necessarily a bad thing on its own. Scale is how a small Cornish bakery becomes a national name in the first place. It's just worth remembering that a pasty made for national distribution and a long shelf life is never going to taste quite like one made that morning at a stall down in Cornwall, however proudly the packaging talks about it. Number 6. Pukka All-Steak Pie. Pukka call themselves the UK's #1 pie brand, and based on the sales data, that's a fair claim rather than an empty boast. It's also, out of everything featured on tonight's list, the highest meat content we found anywhere, sitting at around 27 to 29% beef, depending on the exact pack and retailer. So why does it still belong here? Because the real story with Pukka isn't how much meat is in the pie, it's what's propping the flavour up around it. The current ingredient list includes margarine made from palm and rapeseed fats rather than butter, and monosodium glutamate listed plainly on the pack as a flavour enhancer. If the beef and the gravy were genuinely doing all the work on their own, you wouldn't need it sitting there in black and white. Long-time customers online, some of whom say they've bought Pukka's chicken and mushroom pie for 30 years or more, consistently describe the filling as noticeably thinner than it used to be, with the mushroom reduced to little more than a rumour running through the sauce. It's still, on paper, the best performing pie by meat content anywhere on this list. It's also a useful reminder that a respectable percentage on the label doesn't automatically add up to a respectable pie in the box. Pukka started out in Leicester back in 1963, and it's still an independent family-run company rather than part of one of the big multinational food groups that own most of tonight's other entries. There's something almost admirable about that, given everything else on this list. It just makes the reliance on monosodium glutamate a bit harder to justify. If you're independent, and you're proud of your beef content, and you're genuinely the best-selling pie brand in the country by your own figures, you'd expect the meat and the gravy to be doing the talking on their own, not a flavour enhancer stepping in to finish the sentence for them. Monosodium glutamate isn't dangerous, and the regulators are satisfied it's safe at the levels used here. That's not really the point. The point is why a brand with the most meat on this entire list still feels the need to reach for it at all. Number 5. Wall's Pork Pie. Of everything on tonight's list, Wall's is carrying the heaviest history by a wide margin. The name goes back to 1786, when Richard Wall was granted the first royal appointment as purveyor of pork to the future King George IV. That's a genuinely old, genuinely royal endorsement, sitting behind a pork pie that currently comes in at around 23 to 26% pork on the current label, with sodium nitrite, pork lard, and potato starch doing much of the remaining work. The pastry side of the business today sits with a company called the Complete Food Group, after passing through several hands and manufacturing arrangements over the years. There's a persistent online rumour that a well-known contract catering company owns the Wall's pastry name. It doesn't, and never has. That confusion is understandable, given how many owners this brand has quietly passed through, but the actual current owner has nothing to do with catering at all. What's left standing today is a name older than the United States itself, attached to a pie that's now roughly 3/4 everything except pork. There's an ongoing, fairly good-natured argument among pork pie buyers about the jelly layer, some people wanting a proper thick band of it between the meat and the pastry, others thinking it's the worst part of the whole pie. It's genuinely split down the middle, and that's not something we're going to settle tonight, whichever side of that particular argument you're on. What isn't up for debate is the pork percentage itself, and on a pie carrying a name with this much heritage attached to it, 23 to 26% pork is a modest amount of pork to be building 2.5 centuries of reputation on. Not every disappointing pie on tonight's list is a household name shouting about its heritage. Some of them just sit quietly on the shelf decade after decade, never really asked to explain themselves. Number 4. Bowyers Pork Pie. This one doesn't generate the same anger online as some of the others on this list, and honestly, that's almost the point. Bowyers has been quietly making pork pies and pastry products since 1870, and it's spent most of that time sitting in the background of British food culture. Never quite a household name, never quite disappearing either. Long-time buyers tend to describe it in fairly muted terms, as a pie that's fine, that does the job, that doesn't offend anyone, and doesn't particularly excite anyone either. That's arguably worse than an outright scandal, because at least a scandal gets people talking and comparing notes. A pie that's just quietly, permanently underwhelming gets bought out of habit for decades, without anyone ever stopping to ask whether it's actually any good. If you've bought a Bowyers pie in the last year, and genuinely can't remember what it tasted like 5 minutes later, that's not a coincidence. And it's not really your fault either. It's also notably one of the older names on tonight's list, tracing back over a century and a half, which makes the sheer lack of any real identity in the pie itself even stranger. A brand with that much history behind it should have a signature, a texture, a seasoning, something that makes it recognizably Bowyers rather than recognizably nothing in particular. Right now, it doesn't, and that's worth flagging even without a single dramatic ingredient to point at. Not everything on tonight's list is a heritage name trading on a story from 100 years ago, or a struggling chip shop favorite trying to keep its price down. Some of it is a lot more recent, and considerably more expensive, and the reasons it belongs here are completely different. Number 3. Charlie Bigham's Steak and Ale Pie. This is where price finally becomes genuinely relevant, because Charlie Bigham sits at the premium end of the supermarket chiller, well above what most of the pies on tonight's list cost. Dressed in the language of proper cooking, restaurant technique, and slow braising. The packaging leans hard on the idea that you're paying for something a lot closer to a chef-made pie than a factory one. What you're actually getting is still a mass-produced, industrially assembled product, made at real scale in a real factory like almost everything else on this list, just wrapped in noticeably better marketing and carrying a noticeably higher price tag because of it. Paying considerably more for your pie doesn't automatically buy your way out of modified starches and thickened gravy further down the ingredients panel. Sometimes the most expensive pie in the whole chiller is simply a cheaper pie wearing a much nicer jacket, and the only way to know for sure is to actually turn the box around and read it. None of that makes it a bad pie by the standards of this list. It's just an expensive one making claims that the price alone should back up without you having to check. For the same money, or often less, you could visit an actual butcher, buy proper braising steak and a bottle of decent ale, and end up with something considerably closer to what the packaging here is describing. Number 2. Greggs Steak Bake. Not exactly a pie on this list, and this item isn't sold from a chiller cabinet or a chip shop counter. Greggs has done something genuinely impressive from a pure business standpoint, turning a pastry-wrapped snack into one of the most recognizable food products on the entire British high street, with queues out the door at lunchtime in towns right across the country. The steak bake has become shorthand for a certain kind of quick, cheap, reliably warm lunch, and there's real, genuine affection for it among people who've been buying one on their break for years. But affection isn't the same thing as quality, and Greggs is running an operation built entirely around speed and volume, producing thousands of bakes every single day at a price point designed to keep people coming back without a second thought. That kind of scale comes with trade-offs that are easy to overlook when you're eating one on the move. Long-time customers describe the pastry as noticeably greasy and the filling as heavily seasoned in a way that tends to mask the meat underneath rather than showcase it. It's popular because it's everywhere and it's cheap, not necessarily because it's genuinely good, and there's a difference between the two that's easy to forget when you're rushing back to work. And fair thing to point out is, not everyone has the time, the money, or the local butcher on hand to go for an alternative. And a hot steak bake for not much money is still a filling snack on a cold day. Because this isn't really a knock against the people buying it, but it's fair to expect more from a company this size with this much buying power rather than less. Number 1. Pork Farm's Original Pork Pie. And here's where we need to stop and be completely honest with you, because this one genuinely surprised us. Pork Farms has spent years carrying a reputation as one of the cheaper, less impressive names on the pork pie shelf, regularly criticized, including in our own past research, for leaning on rusk and cheap filler to bulk out the meat. We went and checked the current label, expecting to confirm exactly that, the way we always do before naming a brand. We couldn't. The pork content on Pork Farms' current original pork pie sits at around 27 to 30%, and there's no rusk anywhere in the current recipe. Instead of bread rusk as a filler, it's now built with rice flour and potato starch, and the label makes a specific point of stating there are no artificial nitrites used at all. That's a genuinely different pie to the one this brand built its old reputation on, in either direction, and it's the one entry on tonight's list that's actually moved forward rather than backward. Old reputations are hard to shake, good or bad. And this looks like a rare case where the old one simply isn't fair anymore. We'll keep watching this one because reputations built over decades don't usually turn around this cleanly, but credit where it's due. If you wrote this brand off years ago, and a lot of people clearly have, it might genuinely be worth one more look before you cross it off the list for good. Not every story in this category has to end with another machine pie letting you down. Every so often, one of them actually gets better instead. We're not going to pretend every pie in Britain is heading in the wrong direction, because it isn't, and it would be a fairly miserable note to end on if that were true. So, what actually separates a good pie from a machine pie? It's not complicated, and you don't need a food science degree to work it out at the shelf. Look for a stated meat percentage that's well above a quarter of the pack, not skirting just under it. Check whether water or potato is sitting ahead of the meat on the ingredient list, because if either one is, you already have your answer before you've read another word. Look for butter rather than margarine or vegetable oil doing the work in the pastry. And treat anything that needs monosodium glutamate or a long list of flavor enhancers to taste convincingly of meat as a pie that's quietly telling on itself. None of this takes more than about 10 seconds at the shelf, and it'll tell you more about what you're actually buying than any amount of heritage lettering on the box ever will. With all of that in mind, here are 4 that are actually still worth spending your money on. First, Wright's Pies out of Staffordshire. Wright's has been baking for close to 100 years, and it still sells fresh, same-day pies directly out of its own shops, vans, and a handful of petrol stations, rather than sending everything on a week-long lorry journey first. That's the difference you're genuinely tasting when you bite into one. A proper hot water crust, visible chunks of meat rather than a smooth reformed paste, and a pie that was sitting in a Staffordshire oven that same morning. Not a distribution centre a fortnight earlier. It's not a nationwide supermarket name, and you won't find it everywhere, but for anyone within reach of a Wright's shop or one of their vans, it's about as close as you'll get to the pie a lot of tonight's list is still pretending to be. Second, Marks & Spencer's steak pie from their gastropub range. British beef comes in at around 31%, wrapped in genuine butter pastry rather than margarine or vegetable shortening. It costs noticeably more than most of what's on tonight's avoid list, and for once the extra money is actually going into the pie itself rather than into the packaging wrapped around it. It's not going to feel like a bargain next to a value pie, but it's not pretending to be one either. And the ingredient list backs up exactly what the box promises, which is rarer on this list than it should be. Third, Higgedy. Free-range chicken sits at around 26 to 27% in their chicken and leek pie. The pastry is all butter throughout, and the brand has recently and deliberately removed palm oil from its recipes entirely. It's a smaller, independent name, doing something several of the bigger players on tonight's avoid list have quietly stopped bothering with years ago. It started out as one woman's frustration with the poor quality of supermarket pastry, and it's grown into a genuinely credible chiller cabinet name without losing the thing that made it worth trying in the first place. Fourth, Dickinson & Morris, the original Melton Mowbray pork pie bakers, baking since 1851. The Melton Mowbray pork pie carries genuine protected geographical indication status, which legally requires a hand-raised hot water crust, chopped rather than minced pork, and real bone stock jelly rather than gelatin and water. Nothing about it is built by a machine, and nothing about it can legally be. It's still made the way it was when your grandfather might have carried one on a Sunday picnic. And that's not nostalgia talking. That's simply what the law actually requires it to be, decade after decade. Out of everything we looked at for tonight's list, it's the one pie where the word traditional isn't doing any marketing work at all. It's just a description of the process, written into law rather than printed on a wrapper. We'd genuinely like to know what you think of tonight's list. Tell us in the comments whether you remember any of these pies tasting different years ago, whether you think Pork Farms genuinely earned its way off the avoid list, and which brand you think we missed entirely. We read every single comment, and more than a few of tonight's angles came directly from people telling us exactly this kind of thing after our last investigation. If you want to see more of this, the kind of digging most channels won't bother doing, make sure you're subscribed, because there's plenty more coming, and we're not done with British food standards yet, not by a long way. Until next time, read your labels, back the bakers still doing it properly, and protect your plate.